but including issues of peace, justice, and strong institutions, issues of gender equality, issues of decent work and economic growth, issues of poverty, and also issues of good health and well-being. But the cross-cutting issues that I want to look at, particularly for purpose of this conversation, will center on different issues. You'll see even when I speak to some of the issues, I'll touch on children, I'll touch on discrimination, I'll touch on gender equality and the likes, I'll touch on legal reform, justice reform. The issues are really interrelated. My projector person is not here. Basically, I'm looking at issues relating to journalists, issues relating to human rights defenders, women, children, issues relating to education, also because they are related to access to information as well and related to children. But before I move forward, I think it's important to speak to the issues of international instruments that should be ratified. When Elizabeth was presenting, she mentioned earlier that there's a foundational basis, or there are foundational regional instruments that influence and inform the UPR process. But also there are some human rights instruments that are yet to be ratified, and some of the recommendations were really emphasizing that. So some of the recommendations were repeated by the different countries, but suggested that there should be ratification of the following pieces of legislation. One being the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, the optional protocol to the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment and Punishment, the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, and the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families. So this also touches on issues relating to statelessness as well. So these are some of the recommendations with regards to human rights defenders. Next slide, human rights defenders and journalists. So my task is very easy. Don't judge me for that, but the recommendations are already publicly available, and all I did was to package them into a PowerPoint and maybe summarize. But with regards to human rights defenders and journalists, there's some words there that I just put in bold for emphasis, so that at least if you don't hear anything that I say, in case my English bundles deplete, at least you take away some of those words. Enabling environment, without fear of intimidation or reprisal, against any harassment or persecution, allow civil society to operate independently. Private voluntary organizations act the protection of the civic space. So there are some things that I've been highlighting that we can think about, that we can discuss more, and maybe also from a legislative perspective, that we can see if we are able to influence and spearhead some interventions. So it's important to adopt necessary measures to guarantee the protection of journalists and human rights defenders. As we all know, we are now in election season. We are building up to the 2023 election. And already there have been so many cases of media violations. As MISA, we do monitoring of media violations, and journalists have been unjustifiably arrested. Others have been assaulted by political party supporters, by political party leaders. Other journalists have been barred from attending, some political events, rallies and the likes. They've been refused coverage. So these are all issues that are violations to the guarantee of the protection of journalists. But also, even from a human rights defender's perspective, it's important that the state takes measures to ensure that they can carry out their work in an enabling environment. And of course, it's important also to take all necessary steps to ensure that civil society actors and human rights defenders can operate freely without fear of intimidation and reprisal. As we are speaking, we know that Cabinet approved principles to the amendment of the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act, and there have been mixed feelings around that. So I think it's also as part of compliance, or at least if we are to start thinking about some of these recommendations, it's important to also start having conversations around how possibly some of those recommendations are going to impact the civic space, how they're going to impact the work of human rights defenders, if at all, how they're going to impact the independence of civil society and their operations. So it's important to start thinking about some of those issues as well moving forward, and even as we build up also to the midterm report in 2024. Then another aspect that was highlighted was the issue of the role of public officials in protecting fundamental rights. And I am emphasizing this one as well, because of my bias and our work at the Media Institute. And the picture, so some of the pictures you see in my slide, they're not really, all of them are not from Zimbabwe, but this one, this specific one is actually from Zimbabwe, where, police officers were harassing a cameraman, a journalist, a local journalist. So as we move forward also in terms of these recommendations, the requirements include that there should be systematic training of all law enforcement officers on the proper management of assemblies and the use of force, especially in the context of demonstrations, and on the use of non-violent means of crowd control. And also I'm emphasizing this together with the picture because whenever there are demonstrations or any protests of any kind or any gatherings, journalists are also going to be covering those events. And so many times journalists have been caught in the crossfire. Sometimes the police indiscriminately arrest everyone, including the protesters and including the journalists that are merely, undertaking their professional duties and covering the event. So there are those issues, and sometimes even, cases of assault where journalists are also indiscriminately assaulted together with the other people or the crowds as the police try to deal, with context of demonstrations and protests. So it's important also to start engaging with our officers. I'm looking at Honorable, who is representing the Committee for Home Affairs. This one is for you. It's also important to continue developing actions premised on the commitment of the government towards continuous training of public officials in human rights, broadly, in human rights. And for this one also, I want to emphasize the issue of the Freedom of Information Act. Honorable Amauso here representing the Committee on Media. We have a Freedom of Information Act, which was passed also as part of our process to align legislation with our constitution. It was a progressive step, but you realize that most of our public institutions do not have information officers as yet. The information officers are not yet aware that there is a fundamental duty to promote the right to access information. So we also need to start equipping our public officials, in terms of human rights, and ensure that they are abreast with the different roles and responsibilities that they have in promoting and protecting those rights. Also remembering, of course, that even in terms of our constitution, the provision is there that the state and all institutions and agencies under it have a duty to promote, to protect, and to respect the Bill of Rights. And then the other issue is to finalize the adoption of legislation relating to the Zimbabwe Independent Complaints Commission. And I'm happy that, Fiona had already spoken to that, this bill was already enacted. We now have an act that speaks to the issue of the Independent Complaints Commission. When I speak about commissions later on, I'm going to touch on this, but it's a progressive step also that, we are setting up an independent mechanism for the examination of public complaints related to security service actions. So I really appreciate that as well. And then there's the aspect of access to internet and digital technologies. Honorable Gandawa, this is your forte. And I mean, we appreciate all the things that have been done so far. In Zimbabwe, we have our Child Online Protection Guidelines that were enacted in 2015. But the recommendation is that Zimbabwe should continue to take steps to protect children online through the establishment of the Zimbabwe Child Online Protection Task Force and relevant policies and provisions. I've worked with UNICEF before, and I understand that the task force is there. But my recommendation in compliance with this is that we should review our child online protection guidelines because they are outdated, and we need to start having conversations around, the use of digital technologies by children and ensuring that we protect them online. Also because we have been having conversations around digitization of the education sector. I think it was last year that we were in Kariba with the Speaker of Parliament and different ministries and different commissions, and we spoke about digitization of the education sector. So if we are moving towards e-learning and we're moving towards digitization of the education sector, we need to prioritize the protection of children online. So these components are related to digital rights work that we also spearhead at MISA. And another issue is to take steps to improve access to education during the pandemic, including by providing training for teachers and lecturers on using e-learning platforms. This has been a key concern. I'm sure most parents here would also confirm that, that some of the teachers were not fully equipped and able to interact with online platforms and to, to help children to learn through e-learning platforms. So we need to start also investing in ensuring that, there's training for our teachers around e-learning and around the different platforms that are there. Technology is moving rapidly, and there are so many tools that are at our disposal for our teachers to be able to undertake their work. So we need to also start thinking about training of the teachers and the lecturers on some of these platforms. And also some of the people that are in this profession, we call them digital refugees. Honorable Sekeramai, I don't know if you're a digital refugee in terms of computer literacy and digital literacy. Where are you? Are you up to speed? You are trying, huh? At least you are trying. There are some, colleagues that are still catching up with technology, and you find that those are also the highest components of our lecturers and our teachers. So we need to ensure that we capacitate them and we provide training for them to be able to utilize digital technology for functions of their work and for delivering access to education. Then ensure